All right, good evening. Welcome to the broadcast. Glad you are with us. We're going to be joined tonight by Judge Napolitano. The judge is in the house. We're also going to be joined by Colonel John Mills, and we're going to talk about what are said to be a swarm of drones coming at all sides to Russia today. Is this escalating us closer and closer to a real serious upgrade of war? Because I'm concerned that these drones that are coming to Ukraine are being provided by our government, by the CIA, or at least if another country is providing them at the encouragement of this country. It seems again like one talk show host said last week, war checks all the boxes. War checks all the boxes. They can accomplish so much from covering with the massive collapse of our banking system. They can use it for depopulation. They can use it for pushing through emergency powers. They could even, I think, maybe push through a draft. And that, again, is of great concern to me as a father of a couple kids in that draft range, not to mention a control room full of them that are that age. Then we're going to be joined by State Senator Bob Hall of Texas, along with David Tice, talk about several new things related, continuing to talk about EMP and the new way of warfare and the attack on our power grid, among other things. And then we'll be joined by Margaret Byfield, along with about 3 or 4 other people to join her to talk about the assault on private property and what's happening to some ranchers. Again, this gets right back to just the basics of the U.S. Constitution, the right of private property, folks. We all better be paying attention because it impacts all of us. All right, let's start out first tonight with Judge Napolitano. His website is judgenap.com, judgenap.com. I want to talk to him about the Fulton County, Georgia grand jury forewoman that was on national TV last week discussing the investigation into Trump and laughing about it and how she was hoping that she could swear him in. We'll also talk about the Supreme Court to hear oral arguments tomorrow. That's what we're being told, possibly, if it hasn't already happened, on the president's power to forgive student loans. We'll talk about the federal investigation into the Trump's involvement on January 6th. And much more. Judge, welcome to the broadcast. Thanks for joining us again.
Thank you, my dear friend.
Glad to have you back. You've been a busy man when I go over to judgenap.com. In fact, let's do that right now. Folks, if you want to visit his website, plus not to mention he's got a podcast, a very successful broadcast as well. There it is, judgenap.com, War and the Constitution. This one here caught my eye, The Legacy of George W. Bush and His Torturers. That one I want to touch on real quick, Judge, before we get to some of these other ones, because that one caught my eye. We were one of the few broadcast outlets after 9/11 happened, and they were putting in the Patriot Act. We were one of the few to interview a couple guys that were saying, look out, this Patriot Act, I know a lot of you guys right now are upset and concerned, and this is you want to be a patriot, so you better be for the Patriot Act. But this is a double-edged sword. You wait till someone gets in there that maybe you don't like as much, and look how this can be used against the American people. I remember getting some pretty nasty communications from people because I was interviewing people against the Patriot Act. Your comments, sir?
Well, I have been of the view that the Patriot Act is the most unconstitutional piece of legislation enacted by the Congress since the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 made it a crime to criticize the government. I mean, the Patriot Act allows one FBI agent to authorize another FBI agent to search private property and seize records in utter defiance of the Fourth Amendment, which requires a judge to issue a search warrant based on probable cause. I mean, this is government at its worst. It was passed in the mania that occurred in the weeks and months following 9/11. The House of Representatives was given 15 minutes to read it. It's 112 pages long. You're talking to a person who's read it 3 times. It takes about 15 or 16 hours to read each time because it consists in amending other parts of the criminal code. So you have to have the whole criminal code in front of you, and then you have to go to the parts that are being amended and see how the amendment plays out. This abominable piece of legislation has unleashed the current culture in the FBI on us, which is to search first and worry about whether it's constitutional later. An entire generation of federal agents, not just FBI, DEA, BATF, an entire generation of federal agents has come of age now, 20 years, believing that they have legal means to get around the Fourth Amendment, which protects our privacy. And those legal means begin with the Patriot Act. The piece that you've talked about, George W. Bush and his torturers, points out that the government is engaged in plea bargaining with Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the person who the government says orchestrated 9/11 and against whom the evidence of his guilt is utterly overwhelming. Now, why would they be entering into a plea bargaining negotiation with him? Because the courts are going to allow him to tell the jury of every instance of torture, and there are 183 of them that were visited upon him by the Bush administration. And the Bush administration, which thought that military men on military juries would convict those who confessed under torture and would not be repulsed by hearing the torture, had the sensitivity and sensibility of military men 180 degrees wrong. When a person tells the jury what the CIA did to torture them, the jury, which convicted the person, ends up asking the judge for clemency for the person. So the legal problems that are beginning to manifest themselves now were born in the George W. Bush administration by torture and by the Patriot Act.
And I'm not asking you to pick a side on anything related to presidential politics, so please don't feel like that's the purpose of this question. But I've heard reports that Governor DeSantis, who may run for president, that Governor DeSantis, as a military guy, was down there at Guantanamo Bay, kind of overseeing what some of these things that were, torture, interrogation. Is there any truth to that?
There is truth to the fact that torture was going on at Guantanamo Bay, believe it or not, until the FBI arrived. And the FBI said to the military, you got to stop this or we're leaving because we can't witness this without arresting you, since this is American territory, though it's located in Cuba, and the federal statutes prohibit you doing this. And the FBI, in a day, put a stop to the torture at Guantanamo Bay. I don't know when I know he was in the military. There are many pictures of him in uniform. In fact, I believe he got married in his military uniform. I don't know when Governor DeSantis was there and what his assignments were. I visited Guantanamo Bay on a media day where they brought a bunch of us down. I had been very critical of it, so I was one of those that they brought down. Of course, they showed us all the good parts of it. They didn't show us the parts that they didn't want us to see. So I don't know what Governor DeSantis knew and when he knew it. If it turns out that he was involved in the torture, he'll have a very difficult time getting elected president of the United States. If it turns out he was one of the people that put a stop to it, my hat will be off to him.
Right. I don't think he was involved in doing it. The reports I read is that he was brought in to make sure that they were doing things accordingly and trying to, go by the book. And so
the governor is a lawyer. He knows what is
right.
lawful and what is not. He may very well have been part of the FBI successful efforts to stop the torture, or he may have been there after it stopped. I don't know.
Let's move on to the case related to Fulton County, Georgia grand jury forewoman on national TV. I mean, we've all seen it in the last 10 days, 2 weeks, laughing, quite excited about the opportunity that she hoped she would gain to swear him in.
I'm going to use a word that Archie Bunker used to use, but maybe I'm dating myself. This woman was a dingbat. I mean, I've never seen anything like this. This is what happens sometimes. When you just pick the first 23 people that show up for the grand jury. On a trial jury, the judge and the lawyers get to interrogate the person. And if they're absent-minded or a dingbat, then they're not going to be on the jury. But for this woman to go around and make the rounds of the television networks, not my former network, but many others, and to say, the only reason I wanted the former president to testify this because I wanted to look in his face while I swore him in. This is making light of and child's play of a very, very serious institution, the grand jury. Now, the grand jury in Georgia is different than in most other states. This grand jury, which doesn't exist anymore, did not have the power to indict. It only had the power to investigate. So their investigation resulted in a 500-page report, which will now be read and distributed to another grand jury, which can indict. And I would think that that grand jury will probably indict all the people whom the first grand jury, the one for which this dingbat was the forewoman, they recommended indictments of people. We don't know who. We can probably guess. Now, question: did she violate grand jury secrecy by going on national television? Well, the judge who supervised the grand jury was a little taken aback, as all of us were, by her demeanor on national television. And this judge issued a statement saying she didn't, because under Georgia rules, and here the rules are the same nearly everywhere, as long as you don't mention proper names, as long as you don't say what was deliberated, and as long as you don't say the outcome of the deliberations with respect to individual persons, then you have not violated grand jury secrecy. Grand jury secrecy is intended to protect those who are not indicted, so that the public does not know that they were even candidates for indictment. By saying, well, we deliberated about Mr. X, but decided not to indict him. Well, that would be a crime to make that statement. That would be a profound violation of the secrecy rules. Maybe this woman wasn't a dingbat. Maybe she's very smart and she just got a quirky personality. Maybe I'm being too harsh, because what she said towed the line, but did not go 1 inch over it.
Oh, wow. All right, tell me about the Supreme Court. Where are we at with the oral arguments related to the Biden administration being able to forgive student loans?
Okay, the oral arguments were today. It was
Really?
3 hours of oral arguments for 2 cases. The facts are a little different, but the basics are the same. Can the President of the United States forgive, and I know you know this number and it's startling, $440 billion with a B dollars worth of loans? Now, here's how it works. A student is admitted to a college or university and makes an application for financial aid. The college puts the student in touch with a bank. The bank loans the money. The federal government guarantees that the student will pay the money back. So the money that goes to the college comes from a bank. Everybody's happy. The college gets its money. Student gets his education. The bank has a loan with interest, and that loan is guaranteed by the feds. If the student doesn't pay the money back, then the feds are on the hook, and they pay the bank the money that the student failed to pay with interest. And then they try to pursue the student to see if they can recoup any money back. So if the president were to forgive these student loans, that would require the federal government to pay them. There's 40 million unpaid student loans out there. 26 million applied for forgiveness. But before the government could grant forgiveness, 2 federal judges enjoined the program, saying, wait a minute, $400 million, $400 billion? Only Congress can spend money like that. So if this program were to go through, the Treasury would have to come up with $440 billion to pay these banks. How can the Treasury do that? Because under the Constitution, only Congress can spend money, not the president and not anybody that works for the president. So the argument today was, can the president spend this money on his own? Now, the president argues that under something called the Howse Act of 2002, enacted right after the tragedy of 9/11, the government gave the president the authority to waive, not suspend forever, not get rid of, but to waive the obligation to pay back student loans, because a lot of these students were joining the military right after 9/11 in a patriotic move to protect the country. God forbid some other 9/11 should happen. The country, the United States government, I think this was wrong, but we did it, invaded Afghanistan and then invaded Iraq. 2 invasions, the morality and lawfulness of which we could talk about at your pleasure. But it resulted in the Howse Act, which gave the president the right to waive student loans.
Wow.
Question: when we're at war. Are we at war now? Now, this brings us back to what you were talking about a few minutes ago before you introduced me. Are we at war? Well, Joe Biden has sent military equipment to Ukraine, and it's so sophisticated only Americans can operate it. So there are American troops there operating this equipment.
That's right.
Congress has not declared war. It's not an official war. It's not a legal war, but American troops are shooting at Russian troops. I'm trying to make both sides of the argument for you. The other way that the president can waive the student obligation is in time of emergency. The last emergency was President Trump, the pandemic. Joe Biden rescinded that emergency, saying, well, the pandemic is over. Some people died, some got sick, but COVID, for the most part, is gone, and we have medicines to address it, so the emergency is over. So those 2 points, are we at war, and is there an emergency, were debated in the court today. The other issue is the separation of powers. Can Congress do this? Yes. Congress can spend money and forgive debt however it wants, but the president is not the Congress. Prediction, 6-3, conservatives over liberals against President Biden.
Wow.
This will crush a lot of students and families who are expecting this freebie. But the president can't make his own laws, and he certainly can't spend that kind of money on his own.
Oh, wow. All right, let's talk about this one. The federal investigations into Trump's involvement on January 6th and his retention of national defense information at Mar-a-Lago. They are moving into their final stages. We got a special counsel. What's the latest on this, please?
Well, the special counsel, Jack Smith, very experienced, highly regarded, lifelong prosecutor, who Trump has said just, you know what he's like when somebody gets under his skin. He said just terrible things about this guy, is in the end stages of the investigation. Now, the end stages of the investigation means it's time to decide whether or not you want to indict the former president. Now, how do we know he's in the end stages? Because he's doing the unthinkable, which they only do at the end. He is subpoenaing to testify before a federal grand jury that has the authority to indict. This is not like the grand jury that four-woman was the four-person of in Georgia. He is subpoenaing before a federal grand jury in Washington, D.C., the unthinkable, President Trump's lawyers. Now, you may say, well, you can't subpoena somebody's lawyers. What about the attorney-client privilege? All right, Brannon, when I went to law school, the attorney-client privilege was absolute unless the client told the lawyer, I'm going to commit a crime. So the client comes into your office and said, I robbed a bank. Yeah, I did it, and they're about to arrest me. Get me off the hook. The lawyer can't repeat that. But if the client comes to the lawyer and says, I'm about to rob a bank, not only can the lawyer repeat it, the lawyer has to report it. From that developed what's called the crime fraud exception to the attorney-client privilege, which means this. If the government can show that the client, in this case Donald Trump, and the lawyer, and there's four of them, engaged in a pattern of behavior intended to deceive the government or harm someone else, then there is no attorney-client privilege. So when these lawyers were subpoenaed, they moved to quash the subpoena. And in a secret hearing, because the grand jury is secret, the government presented evidence, we don't know what it was, to demonstrate that President Trump and his lawyers engaged in either crimes or acts of deception. The judge accepted the argument, ordered them to testify, and they did. We don't know what they said. We don't know what the alleged crime or fraud was, but we know that a federal judge, a well-respected federal judge in Washington, D.C., found that there was enough evidence there to order them to testify. Wow. The second reason we know that Jack Smith is coming to the end of his investigation is because he subpoenaed Mike Pence. The former vice president has said he doesn't want to testify, and he's arguing what's called the speech and debate clause. What's that? The speech and debate clause is a clause in the Constitution that says members of Congress shall not be called into question or prosecuted for anything they say in their official work, any speech they give on the floor of the House or the Senate, any conversation they have on their way to the House or the Senate, any statement they make at a House or Senate committee meeting. Well, what about Mike Pence? He's not in the Congress. Why would it apply to him? This is a very novel argument that Dick Cheney once made and he lost. Mike Pence will argue before a federal judge that when he was presiding over a joint session of Congress to count the electoral votes, that's the session that was disrupted by whatever happened on January 6th. To the government, it was an insurrection. To others, it was a political demonstration. But that was the session that was disrupted. Mike Pence will argue for all practical purposes he was a member of Congress at that time. And therefore, what he heard from the president, what he said to the president, he can't be compelled to reveal. I happen to think that argument is very weak. And by making it, Mike Pence, whom I have known for 20 years and whom I like a great deal for a variety of reasons, is demeaning himself. On top of that, he wrote an autobiography entitled So Help Me God. And in the autobiography, he talks about what happened on January 6th and what the president said to him and what he said to the president. So whatever he's going to tell a jury, he already told his publisher, and you can go to a bookstore or go to Amazon and get the book and read what he said.
All right, good report.
This is a lot of explanation for one segment.
That's all right, but that's why you're here. I want to get to this one real quick before we go, because it fits with what's going on tonight and my next guest, Colonel John Mills. It's on Judge Knapp's website, judgeknapp.com, judgeknapp.com. War and the Constitution. Can the president fight any war he wishes? And can Congress fund any war it wishes?
The short answer is no. Only Congress can declare war under the Constitution. And under the treaties we have signed, Congress can only declare war against a country or an entity that poses a serious military threat to the United States of America. Does Russia pose a serious military threat to the United States of America? Absolutely not. Does Russia pose any threat to the United States of America? Yeah, it might harm our economy if we keep up with these sanctions and we can't trade with Russian industry. I'm being a little snarky there. Joe Biden was given a blank check by the Congress. Here's these billions again for 113 billion with a B dollars to spend however he wants on Ukraine. He has spent about 50 billion already. He has announced an intention to spend about another 8 billion. Among the 50 billion is cash. Imagine giving cash to a government as corrupt as Ukraine, but he's done that.
Yep.
And military equipment. Much of the military equipment can only be operated by Americans. Are there American troops in Ukraine? Answer, yes. They are out of uniform, which allows the president to say we don't have boots on the ground, but it exposes them to the absence of protection by the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions require that you wear a uniform with a recognizable insignia on it. When you're out of uniform, you can be shot by the enemy, you can be summarily arrested and summarily executed as a spy. Thanks be to God it hasn't happened. Why are they there? Because the equipment we have given to the Ukrainian government is so complicated, Americans are operating. So you have HIMARS, which are very, very sophisticated offensive weaponry that shoot missiles. You have American troops out of uniform in Ukraine designating the target. Russians in Ukraine, Russian troops in Russia. You have American troops in uniform in Poland pulling the trigger. It's not an actual trigger. It looks like a television control room. There's a lot of buttons and switches that have to go off at the same time, so there's no error. Question: are American soldiers shooting at Russians in Ukraine? Answer: yes. Is there any lawful basis for this? Answer: no. What about the War Powers Act of the War Powers Resolution of 1973, which was enacted over President Nixon's veto? This allows the president to wage a mini war for 90 days, providing he tells the Congress and after 90 days gets their consent. Well, we and this equipment have been there far longer than 90 days, and President Biden hasn't told the Congress and hasn't asked for their consent. The war is illegal, it is unconstitutional, it is immoral, and we shouldn't be there.
Well, you know, there's a lot of people that will, argue all the things you've said, but I'll tell you where you and I agree. I don't see our national interest over there. I don't see what our national interests are. This is a group of people that have been fighting for hundreds of years. I don't want my money spent over there. I feel bad for the Ukrainian people. It's a corrupt government. I don't care what, people all want to make Zelensky out to be some hero. I don't buy it. But I'm not interested in spending my tax dollars over there. I'm not interested in spilling American blood over there. And I'm certainly not interested in getting into World War III with a proxy war through Ukraine with Russia and then, i.e., China. And I'm certainly not interested in seeing them get to a spot now that the military is so depleted that they want to go into a draft and send the control room full of about 4 guys in their 20s over there. So you and I are in agreement on a lot of issues related to the fact I don't want us over there and messing with this. I have other friends, and they're good friends, that think we have to be stopping Russia right there. And I'm like,
well, I have friends that feel that way as well, and they say to me, "What are you, a lefty? What are you, a modern day hippie, or you're on the anti-war side? Well,
Right.
call me whatever you want."
right.
But we shouldn't have a dog in this fight. There is no national interest to
I
the
agree.
United States, and the American public would not tolerate a draft and would not tolerate a single American boy or girl being killed by the Russians because of Ukraine, of all places.
Which makes me fear, Colonel. Which makes me fear, Judge. What will they do so the American people will be willing to offer up their kids? Because
you
they
can ask
the
colonel. You can ask the colonel who's coming up, but the government will do all kinds of things. The balloon that we talked about. Remember a month ago, the whole country was staring in the sky looking at a balloon? That was a stunt to demonize China, because Joe Biden also wants to fight a war against China to protect Taiwan from being taken over by the Chinese. Another war that we would have no interest in the outcome. They will demonize the adversary. They've begun to demonize Putin already, so that war will seem natural and not forced.
And I think they need an attack of some kind in America, just like they used Pearl Harbor to get Americans who said, I don't want us getting involved in World War II. And yet Pearl Harbor happened, and boom, everybody signed up, and everybody's, yeah, let's go. I think they will use some kind of event like that to convince Americans to get behind the idea of war. Final comment?
I believe Joe Biden wants to run for re-election as a wartime president, like his 2 heroes, Abraham Lincoln and Franklin D. Roosevelt. And if he puts his re-election over the lives of American young men and women, he is undeserving of public office.
JudgeNap.com, JudgeNap.com. Tell them about your TV show as well.
Well, Judging Freedom has been doing quite well. We get about 1.8 million, 1.9 million views a week now, and we've been pounding the anti-war message. This is a libertarian, small government, stop borrowing money, get out of my face argument that we have no dog in this fight and we don't belong there. Colonel Doug McGregor, a great military historian, West Point graduate, and the great Scott Ritter, and the great Lieutenant Colonel Tony Schaefer are our 3 military experts that come on a regular basis and make the case that Russia will win, Ukraine will lose. All we're doing is extending a war and causing more innocents to die. We have no business being there.
Judge Nap.
That's what Judging Freedom does. Tony Schaefer was on today, Colonel McGregor, and Scott Ritter Thursday afternoon.
Check it out, folks. JudgeNap.com. JudgeNap.com. Great stuff. Thank you, Judge, as always. Look forward to having you back.
Oh, pleasure. And give my best to those boys in the control room.
I sure will.
Tell them if we have a sane head in the Oval Office, they have nothing to worry about.
Well, they're not going either way. At least the one that belongs to me is not going. I sound like a hippie anti-war guy now. Well, but I'm sorry, he's not going. Thank you,
God
Judge.
Bless you.
You too.
God
Judge
bless
Nap
you.
checking in. Check out his site, judgenap.com, judgenap.com. Look at this from Epoch Times tonight. Almost 80% of Americans aged 17 to 24 unfit for military service. Well, there you go. I don't know. What does that mean for a draft? You're going to draft 20%? Wow.